At sunset, when the vermilion glow reflected from the dunes along the horizon fitfully illuminated the white faces of the abandoned hotels, Bridgman stepped onto his balcony and looked out over the long stretches of cooling sand as the tides of purple shadow seeped across them, slowly extending their slender fingers through the shallow saddles and depressions. The shadows massed together like gigantic combs, a few phosphorescing spurs of obsidian isolated for a moment between the tines, and then finally coalesced and flooded in a solid wave across the half-submerged hotels. Behind the silent facades and the tilting sand-filled streets which had once glittered with cocktail bars and restaurants, it was already night. Halos of moonlight beaded the lamp standards of silver dew and draped the shuttered windows in slipping cornices like a frost of frozen gas. As Bridgman watched, his lean bronzed arms propped against the rusting rail, the last walls of light sank away into the Ceres funnel withdrawing below the horizon, and the first wind stirred across the dead Martian sand. Here and there miniature cyclones whirled about a sand spur, drawing off swirling feathers of moon-washed spray, and a nimbus of white dust swept across the dunes and settled in the dips and hollows. Gradually the drifts accumulated, edging towards the former shoreline below the hotels, where already the first 4 floors had been inundated, and the sand now reached up to within 2 feet of Bridgman's balcony. After the next sandstorm, he would be forced yet again to move to the floor above. "Bridgman!" The voice cleft the darkness like a spear. 50 yards to his right, at the edge of the derelict sand break he had once attempted to build below the hotel, a square, stocky figure wearing a pair of frayed cotton shorts waved up at him. The moonlight etched the broad, sinewy muscles of his chest, the powerful bowed legs, sinking almost to their calves in the soft Martian sand. He was about 45 years old, his thinning hair close-cropped so that he seemed almost bald. In his right hand he carried a large canvas hold-all. Bridgman smiled to himself. Standing there patiently in the moonlight below the derelict hotel, Travis reminded him of some long-delayed tourist arriving at a ghost resort years after its extinction. "Bridgman, are you coming?" When the latter still leaned on his balcony rail, Travis added, "The next conjunction is tomorrow." Bridgman shook his head, a rictus of annoyance twisting his mouth. He hated the bi-monthly conjunctions when all 7 of the derelict satellite capsules still orbiting the Earth crossed the sky together. Invariably on these nights he remained in his room, playing over the old memo tapes he had salvaged from the submerged chalets and motels further along the beach. The hysterical "This is Mamie Goldberg, 62955 Coca Boulevard. I really want to protest against this crazy evacuation," or resigned, "Sam Snade here. The Pontiac convertible in the back garage belongs to anyone who can dig it out." Travis and Louise Woodward always came to the hotel on the conjunction nights. It was the highest building in the resort, with an unrestricted view from horizon to horizon, and would follow the 7 converging stars as they pursued their endless courses around the globe. Both would be oblivious of everything else, which the wardens knew only too well, and they reserved their most careful searches of the sand sea for these bi-monthly occasions. Invariably, Bridgman found himself forced to act as lookout for the other 2. "I was out last night," he called down to Travis. "Keep away from the northeast perimeter fence by the Cape. They'll be busy repairing the track." Most nights Bridgman divided his time between excavating the buried motels for caches of supplies. The former inhabitants of the resort area had assumed the government would soon rescind its evacuation order, and disconnecting the sections of metal roadway laid across the desert for the warden's jeeps. Each of the squares of wire mesh was about 5 yards wide and weighed over 300 pounds. After he had snapped the lines of rivets, dragged the sections away, and buried them among the dunes, he would be exhausted and spend most of the next day nursing his strained hands and shoulders. Some sections of the track were now permanently anchored with heavy steel stakes, and he knew that sooner or later they would be unable to delay the wardens by sabotaging the roadway. Travis hesitated, and with a non-committal shrug disappeared among the dunes, the heavy tool bag swinging easily from one powerful arm. Despite the meagre diet which sustained him, his energy and determination seemed undiminished. In a single night, Bridgman had watched him dismantle 20 sections of track and then loop together the adjacent limbs of a crossroad, sending an entire convoy of 6 vehicles off into the wastelands to the south. Bridgman turned from the balcony, then stepped when a faint tang of brine touched the cool air. 10 miles away, hidden by the lines of dunes, was the sea, the long green rollers of the middle Atlantic breaking against the red Martian strand. When he had first come to the beach 5 years earlier, there had never been the faintest scent of brine across the intervening miles of sand. Slowly, however, the Atlantic was driving the shore back to its former margins. The tireless shoulder of the Gulf Stream drummed against the soft Martian dust and piled the dunes into grotesque rococo reefs which the wind carried away into the sand sea. Gradually the ocean was returning, reclaiming its great smooth basin, sifting out the black quartz and Martian obsidian, which would never be wind-borne, and drawing these down into its deeps. More and more often the stain of brine would hang on the evening air, reminding Bridgman why he had first come to the beach and removing any inclination to leave. 3 years earlier he had attempted to measure the rate of approach by driving a series of stakes into the sand at the water's edge, but the shifting contours of the dunes carried away the coloured poles. Later, using the promontory at Cape Canaveral, where the old launching gantries and landing ramps reared up into the sky like derelict pieces of giant sculpture, he had calculated by triangulation that the advance was little more than 30 yards per year. At this rate, without wanting to, he had automatically made the calculation. It would be well over 500 years before the Atlantic reached its former littoral at Coca Beach. Though discouragingly slow, the movement was nonetheless in a forward direction, and Bridgman was happy to remain in his hotel 10 miles away across the dunes, conceding towards his time of arrival the few years he had at his disposal. Later, shortly after Louise Woodward's arrival, he had thought of dismantling one of the motel cabins and building himself a small chalet by the water's edge, but the shoreline had been too dismal and forbidding. The great red dunes rolled on for miles, cutting off half the sky, dissolving slowly under the impact of the slate-green water. There was no formal tide line, but only a steep shelf littered with nodes of quartz and rusting fragments of Mars rockets brought back with the ballast. He spent a few days in a cave below a towering sand reef, watching the long galleries of compacted red dust crumble and dissolve as the cold Atlantic stream sliced through them, collapsing like the decorated colonnades of a Baroque cathedral. In the summer, the heat reverberated from the hot sand as from the slag of some molten sun, burning the rubber soles from his boots, and the light from the scattered flints of washed quartz flickered with diamond hardness. Bridgman had returned to the hotel, grateful for his room overlooking the silent dunes. Leaving the balcony, the sweet smell of brine still in his nostrils, he went over to the desk. A small cone of shielded light shone down over the tape recorder and rack of spools. The rumble of the warden's unsilenced engines always gave him at least 5 minutes warning of their arrival, and it would have been safe to install another lamp in the room. There were no roadways between the hotel and the sea, and from a distance any light reflected onto the balcony was indistinguishable from the corona of glimmering phosphors which hung over the sand like myriads of fireflies. However, Bridgman preferred to sit in the darkened suite, enclosed by the circle of books on the makeshift shelves, the shadow-filled air playing over his shoulders through the long night as he toyed with the memo tapes, fragments of a vanished and unregretted past. By day he always drew the blinds, immolating himself in a world of perpetual twilight. Bridgman had easily adapted himself to his self-isolation, soon evolved a system of daily routines that gave him the maximum of time to spend on his private reveries. Pinned to the walls around him were a series of huge white prints and architectural drawings, depicting various elevations of a fantastic Martian city he had once designed, its glass spires and curtained walls rising like heliotropic jewels from the Vermilion Desert. In fact, the whole city was a vast piece of jewelry, each elevation brilliantly visualized, but as symmetrical and ultimately as lifeless as a crown. Bridgman continually retouched the drawings, inserting more and more details so that they always seemed to be photographs of an original. Most of the hotels in the town, one of a dozen similar resorts, buried by the sand which had once formed an unbroken strip of motels, chalets, and five-star hotels, 30 miles to the south of Cape Canaveral, were well stocked with supplies of canned food abandoned, and the area was evacuated and wired off. There were ample reservoirs and cisterns filled with water, apart from 1,000 intact cocktail bars, 6 feet below the surface of the sand. Travis had excavated a dozen of these in search of his favourite vintage bourbon. Walking out across the desert behind the town, one would suddenly find a short flight of steps cut into the annealed sand and crawl below an occluded sign announcing the satellite bar or the orbit room into the inner sanctum, where the jutting deck of a chromium bar had been cleared as far as the diamond-paned mirror freighted with its rows of bottles and figurines. Bridgman would have been glad to see them left undisturbed. The whole trash of amusement arcades and cheap bars on the outskirts of the beach resorts were a depressing commentary on the original space flights, reducing them to the level of monster sideshows at a carnival. Outside his room, steps sounded along the corridor, then slowly climbed the stairway, pausing for a few seconds at every landing. Bridgman lowered the memo tape in his hand, listening to the familiar tired footsteps. This was Louise Woodward, making her invariable evening ascent to the roof 10 stories above. Bridgman glanced at the timetable pinned to the wall. Only 2 of the satellites would be visible between 12:25 and 12:35 a.m. at an elevation of 62 degrees in the southwest, passing through Cetus and Eridanus, neither of them containing her husband. Although the sitting was 2 hours away, she was already taking up her position and would remain there until dawn. Bridgman listened wanly to the feet recede slowly up the stairwell. All through the night the slim, pale-faced woman would sit out under the moonlit sky as the soft Martian sand her husband had given his life to reach sifted around her in the dark wind, stroking her faded hair like some mourning mariner's wife, waiting for the sea to surrender her husband's body. Travis usually joined her later, and the two of them sat side by side against the elevator house, the frosted letters of the hotel's neon signs strewn around their feet like the fragments of a dismembered zodiac. Then at dawn made their way down into the shadow-filled streets to their eyries in the nearby hotels. Initially, Bridgman often joined their nocturnal vigil, but after a few nights he began to feel something repellent, if not actually ghoulish, about their mindless contemplation of the stars. This is not so much because of the macabre spectacle of the dead astronauts orbiting the planet in their capsules, but because of the curious sense of unspoken communion between Travis and Louise Woodward, almost as if they were celebrating a private rite to which Bridgman could never be initiated. Whatever their original motives, Bridgman sometimes suspected that these had been overlaid by other, more personal ones. Ostensibly, Louise Woodward was watching her husband's satellite in order to keep alive his memory, but Bridgman guessed that the memories she unconsciously wished to perpetuate were those of herself 20 years earlier, when her husband had been a celebrity and she herself courted by magazine columnists and TV reporters. 15 years after his death, Woodward had been killed testing a new lightweight launching platform. She had lived a nomadic existence, driving restlessly in her cheap car from motel to motel across the continent, following her husband's star as it disappeared into the eastern night, and had at last made her home at Coca Beach in sight of the rushing trees across the bay. Travis's real motives are probably more complex. To Bridgman, after they had known each other for a couple of years, he had confided that he felt himself bound by a debt of honor to maintain a watch over the dead astronauts for the example of courage and sacrifice they had set him as a child, although most of them had been piloting their wrecked capsules for 50 years before Travis's birth, and that now they were virtually forgotten, he must single-handedly keep alive the fading flame of their memory. Bridgman was convinced of his sincerity. Yet later, going through a pile of old news magazines in the trunk of a car he excavated from a motel port, he came across a picture of Travis wearing an aluminum pressure suit and learned something more of his story. Apparently Travis had at one time himself been an astronaut, or rather a would-be astronaut, a test pilot for one of the civilian agencies setting up orbital relay stations. His nerve had failed him a few seconds before the last hold of his countdown, a moment of pure unexpected funk that cost the company some $5 million. Obviously it was his inability to come to terms with this failure of character, unfortunately discovered lying flat on his back on a contour couch 200 feet above the launching pad, which had brought Travis to Canaveral, the abandoned mecca of the first heroes of astronautics. Tactfully, Bridgman had tried to explain that no one would blame him for this failure of nerve, less his responsibility from that of the selectors who had picked him for the flight, or at least the result of an unhappy concatenation of ambiguously worded multiple-choice questions. Crosses in the wrong boxes, some heavier to bear and harder to open than others, Bridgman had joked sardonically to himself, but Travis seemed to have reached his own decision about himself. Night after night he watched a brilliant funerary convoy weave its gilded pathway towards the dawn sun, salving his own failure by identifying it with the greater but blameless failure of the 7 astronauts. Travis still wore his hair in the regulation Mohican cut of the spaceman, still kept himself in perfect physical trim by the vigorous routines he had practiced before his abortive flight. Sustained by the personal myth he had created, he was now more or less unreachable. Dear Harry, I've taken the car in deposit box. Sorry it should end like... Irritably, Bridgman switched off the memo tape in its recapitulation of some 30-year-old private triviality. For some reason he seemed unable to accept Travis and Louise Woodward for what they were. He disliked this failure of compassion, a nagging compulsion to expose other people's motives and strip away the insulating sheaths around their naked nerve strings, particularly as his own motives of being at Cape Canaveral were so suspect. Why was he there? What failures was he trying to expiate? Why choose Coca Beach as his penitential shore? For 3 years he had asked himself these questions, so often that they had ceased to have any meaning, like a fossilized catechism or the blunted self-recrimination of a paranoiac. He had resigned his job as the chief architect of a big space development company after the large government contract on which the firm depended for the design of the first Martian city settlement was awarded to a rival consortium. Secretly, however, he realized that his resignation had marked his unconscious acceptance that despite his great imaginative gifts, he was unequal to the specialized and more prosaic tasks of designing the settlement. On the drawing board, as elsewhere, he would always remain earthbound. His dreams of building a new Gothic architecture of launching ports and controlled gantries, being the Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier of the first city to be raised outside Earth, faded forever, but leaving him unable to accept the alternative of turning out endless plans for low-cost hospitals in Ecuador and housing estates in Tokyo. For a year he had drifted aimlessly, but a few colour photographs of the vermilion sunsets at Coca Beach and a news story about the recluses living on in the submerged motels had provided a powerful compass. He dropped the memo tape into a drawer, making an effort to accept Louise Woodward and Travis on their own terms, a wife keeping watch over her dead husband and an old astronaut maintaining a solitary vigil over the memories of his lost comrades in arms. The wind gusted against the balcony window, and a light spray of sand rained across the floor. At night, dust storms churned along the beach. Thermal pools isolated by the cooling desert would suddenly accrete like beads of quicksilver and erupt across the fluffy sand in miniature tornadoes. Only 50 yards away, the dying cough of a heavy diesel cut through the shadows. Quickly, Bridgman turned off the small desk light, grateful for his meanness over the battery packs plugged into the circuit, then stepped to the window. At the leftward edge of the sand break, half hidden in the long shadows cast by the hotel, was a large tracked vehicle with a low camouflaged hull. A narrow observation bridge had been built over the bumpers directly in front of the squat snout of the engine housing, and two of the beach wardens were craning up through the plexiglass windows at the balconies of the hotel, shifting their binoculars from room to room. Behind them, under the glass dome of the extended driving cabin, were three more wardens, controlling an outboard spotlight. In the centre of the bowl, a thin mote of light pulsed with the rhythm of the engine, ready to throw its powerful beam into any of the open rooms. Bridgman hid back behind the shutters as the binoculars focused upon the adjacent balcony, moved to his own, hesitated, and passed to the next. Exasperated by the sabotaging of the roadways, the wardens had evidently decided on a new type of vehicle. With their four broad tracks, the huge squat sand cars would be free of the mesh roadways and able to rove at will through the dunes and sand hills. Bridgman watched the vehicle reverse slowly, its engine barely varying its deep bass growl, then move off along the line of hotels, almost indistinguishable in profile among the shifting dunes and hillocks. 100 yards away, at the first intersection, it turned towards the main boulevard, wisps of dust streaming from the metal cleats like thin spumes of steam. The men in the observation bridge were still watching the hotel. Bridgman was certain that they had seen a reflected glimmer of light, or perhaps a movement of Louise Woodward's on the roof. However reluctant to leave the car and be contaminated by the poisonous dust, the wardens would not hesitate if the capture of one of the beachcombers warranted it. Racing up the staircase, Bridgman made his way to the roof, crouching below the windows that overlooked the boulevard. Like a huge crab, the sandcar had parked under the jutting overhang of the big department store opposite. Once 50 feet from the ground, the concrete lip was now separated from it by little more than 6 or 7 feet, and the sandcar was hidden in the shadows below it, engine silent. A single movement in a window, or the unexpected return of Travis, and the wardens would spring from the hatchways, their long-handled nets and lassos pinioning them around the necks and ankles. Bridgman remembered one beachcomber he had seen flushed from his motel hideout and carried off like a huge twitching spider at the centre of a black rubber web, the wardens with their averted faces and masked mouths like devils in an abstract ballet. Reaching the roof, Bridgman stepped out into the opaque white moonlight. Louise Woodward was leaning on the balcony, looking out towards the distant unseen sea. At the faint sound of the door creaking, she turned and began to walk listlessly around the roof, her pale face floating like a nimbus. She wore a freshly ironed print dress she had found in a rusty spin-drying run of the laundrettes, and her streaked blonde hair floated out lightly behind her on the wind. "Louise!" Involuntarily she started, tripping over a fragment of the neon sign, then moved backwards towards the balcony overlooking the boulevard. "Mrs. Woodward!" Bridgman held her by the elbow, raised a hand to her mouth before she could cry out. "The wardens are down below. They're watching the hotel. We must find Travis before he returns." Louise hesitated, apparently recognizing Bridgman only by an effort, and her eyes turned up to the black marble sky. Bridgman looked at his watch. It was almost 12:25. He searched for stars in the southwest. Louise murmured, "They're nearly here now. I must see them." "Where is Travis? He should be here?" Bridgman pulled at her arm. "Perhaps he saw the sandcar. Mrs. Woodward, we should leave." Suddenly she pointed up at the sky, then wrenched away from him and ran to the rail. "There they are." Fretting, Bridgman waited until she had filled her eyes with the two companion points of light speeding from the western horizon. These were Merrill and Pokrovsky. Like every schoolboy, he knew the sequences perfectly, a second system of constellations of more complex but far more tangible periodicity and procession. The Castor and Pollux of the orbiting zodiac, whose appearance always heralded a full conjunction the following night. Louise Woodward gazed up at them from the rail, the rising wind lifting her hair off her shoulders and entraining it horizontally behind her head. Round her feet the red Martian dust swirled and rustled, silting over the fragments of the old neon sign, a brilliant pink spume streaming from her long fingers as they moved along the balcony edge. When the satellites finally disappeared among the stars along the horizon, she leaned forwards, her face raised to the milk-blue moon as if to delay their departure, then turned back to Bridgman, a bright smile on her face. His early suspicions vanishing, Bridgman smiled back at her encouragingly. "Roger will be here tomorrow night, Louise. We must be careful the wardens don't catch us before we see him." He felt a sudden admiration for her at the stoical way she had sustained herself during her long vigil. Perhaps she thought if Woodward was still alive and in some way was patiently waiting for him to return. He remembered her saying once, "Roger was only a boy when he took off, you know. I feel more like his mother now," as if frightened how Woodward would react to her dry skin and fading hair, fearing that he might even have forgotten her. No doubt the death she visualized for him was of a different order from the mortal kind. Hand in hand, they tiptoed carefully down the flaking steps, jumped down from a terrace window into the soft sand below the windbreak. Bridgman sank to his knees in the fine silver moon dust, then waded up to the firmer ground, pulling Louise after him. They climbed through a breach in the tilting palisades, then ran away from the line of dead hotels looming like skulls in the empty light. "Paul, wait." Her head still raised to the sky, Louise Woodward fell to her knees in a hollow between two dunes. With a laugh stumbled after Bridgman as he raced through the dips and saddles. The wind was now whipping the sand off the higher crests, flurries of dust spurting like excited wavelets. 100 yards away, the town was a fading film set, projected by the camera obscura of the sinking moon. They were standing where the long Atlantic seas had once been 10 fathoms deep, and Bridgman could scent again the tang of brine among the flickering white caps of dust, phosphorescing like shoals of animalcula. He waited for any signs of Travis. "Louise will have to go back to the town. The sandstorms are blowing up. We'll never see Travis here." They moved back through the dunes, then worked their way among the narrow alleyways between the hotels to the northern gateway to the town. Bridgman found a vantage point in a small apartment block, and they lay down looking out below a window lintel into the sloping street, the warm sand forming a pleasant cushion. At the intersections, the dust blew across the roadway in white clouds, obscuring the warden's beach car parked 100 yards down the boulevard. Half an hour later, an engine surged, and Bridgman began to pile sand into the interval in front of them. "They're going, thank God." Louise Woodward held his arm. "Look!" 50 feet away, his white vinyl suit half hidden in the dust clouds, one of the wardens was advancing slowly towards them, his lasso twirling lightly in his hand. A few feet behind was a second warden, craning up at the windows of the apartment block with his binoculars. Bridgman and Louise crawled back below the ceiling, then ducked their way under a transom into the kitchen at the rear. A window opened onto a sand-filled yard, and they darted away through the lifting dust that whirled between the buildings. Suddenly, around a corner, they saw the line of wardens moving down a side street, the sandcar edging along behind them. Before Bridgman could steady himself, a spasm of pain seized his right calf, contorting the gastrocnemius muscle, and he fell to one knee. Louise Woodward pulled him back against the wall, then pointed at a squat, bow-legged figure trudging towards them along the curving road into town. "Travis!" The tool bag swung from his right hand, and his feet rang faintly on the wire mesh roadway. Head down, he seemed unaware of the wardens hidden by a bend in the road. "Come on!" Disregarding the negligible margin of safety, Bridgman clambered to his feet and impetuously ran out into the center of the street. Louise tried to stop him, and they had covered only 10 yards before the wardens saw them. There was a warning shout, and the spotlight flung its giant cone down the street. The sandcar surged forward, like a massive dust-covered bull, its tracks clawing at the sand. "Travis!" As Bridgman reached the bend, Louise Woodward 10 yards behind, Travis looked up from his reverie, then flung the tool bag over one shoulder and raced ahead of them towards the clutter of motel roofs protruding from the other side of the street. Lagging behind the others, Bridgman again felt the cramp attack his leg, broke off into a painful shuffle. When Travis came back for him, Bridgman tried to wave him away. But Travis pinioned his elbow and propelled him forward like an attendant straight-arming a patient. The dust swirling around them, they disappeared through the fading streets and out into the desert, the shouts of the beach wardens lost in the roar and clamour of the baying engine. Around them, like the strange metallic flora of some extraterrestrial garden, the old neon signs jutted from the red Martian sand. Satellite Motel, Planet Bar, Mercury Motel. Hiding behind them, they reached for scrub-covered dunes on the edge of the town, then picked up one of the trails that led away among the sand reefs. There in the deep grottos of compacted sand which hung like inverted palaces, they waited until the storm subsided. Shortly before dawn, the wardens abandoned their search, unable to bring the heavy sandcar onto the disintegrating reef. Contemptuous of the wardens, Travis lit a small fire with his cigarette lighter, burning splinters of driftwood that had gathered in the gullies. Bridgman crouched beside it, warming his hands. "This is the first time they've been prepared to leave the sandcar," he remarked to Travis. "It means they're under orders to catch us." Travis shrugged. "Maybe. They're extending the fence along the beach. They probably intend to seal us in forever." "What?" Bridgman stood up with a sudden feeling of uneasiness. "Why should they? Are you sure? I mean, what would be the point?" Travis looked up at him, a flicker of dry amusement on his bleached face. Wisps of smoke wreathed his head, curled up past the serpentine columns of the grotto to the winding interval of sky 100 feet above. "Bridgman, forgive me saying so, but if you want to leave here, you should leave now. In a month's time you won't be able to." Bridgman ignored this and searched the cleft of dark sky overhead, which framed the constellation Scorpio as if hoping to see a reflection of the distant sea. They must be crazy. "How much of this fence did you see?" "About 800 yards. It won't take them long to complete. The sections are prefabricated, about 40 feet high." He smiled ironically at Bridgman's discomfort. "Relax, Bridgman. If you do want to get out, you'll always be able to tunnel underneath it." "I don't want to get out," Bridgman said coldly. "Damn them, Travis. They're turning the place into a zoo. You know it won't be the same with a fence all the way around it. A corner of Earth that is forever Mars." Under the high forehead, Travis's eyes were sharp and watchful. "I see their point. There hasn't been a fatal casualty now." He glanced at Louise Woodward, who was strolling about in the colonnades. "For nearly 20 years, and passenger rockets are supposed to be as safe as commuters' trains. They're quietly sealing off the past. Louise and I knew with it. I suppose it's pretty considerate of them not to burn the place down with flamethrowers. The virus would be a sufficient excuse. After all, we three are probably the only reservoirs left on the planet." He picked up a handful of red dust and examined the fine crystals of a somber eye. "Well, Bridgman, what are you going to do?" His thoughts discharging themselves through his mind like frantic signal flares, Bridgman walked away without answering. Behind them, Louise Woodward wandered among the deep galleries of the grotto, crooning to herself in a low voice to the sighing rhythms of the whirling sand. The next morning they returned to the town, wading through the deep drifts of sand that lay like a fresh fall of red snow between the hotels and stores, coruscating in the brilliant sunlight. Travis and Louise Woodward made their way towards their quarters in the motels further down the beach. Bridgman searched for still crystal air for any signs of the wardens, but the sandcar had gone, his tracks obliterated by the storm. In his room he found their calling card. A huge tide of dust had flowed through the French windows and submerged the desk and bed, 3 feet deep against the rear wall. Outside, the sandbreak had been inundated and the contours of the desert completely altered, a few spires of obsidian marking its former perspectives like bayous on a shifting sea. Bridgman spent the morning digging out his books and equipment, dismantled the electrical system and its batteries, and carried everything to the room above. He would have moved to the penthouse on the top floor, but his lights would have been visible for miles. Settling into his new quarters, he switched on the tape recorder, heard a short, clipped message in the brisk voice which had shouted orders at the wardens the previous evening. "Bridgman, this is Major Webster, Deputy Commandant of Cocoa Beach Reservation. On the instructions of the Antiviral Subcommittee of the UN General Assembly, we are now building a continuous fence around the beach area. On completion, no further egress will be allowed, and anyone escaping will be immediately returned to the reservation. Give yourself up now, Bridgman." Before Bridgman stopped the tape, then reversed the spool and erased the message, staring angrily at the instrument. Unable to settle down to the task of rewiring the room's circuits, he paced about, fiddling with the architectural drawings propped against the wall. He felt restless and hyper-excited, perhaps because he had been trying to repress, not very successfully, precisely those doubts of which Webster had now reminded him. He stepped onto the balcony and looked out over the desert at the red dunes rolling to the windows directly below. For the 4th time he had moved up to the floor, and the sequence of identical rooms he had occupied was like displaced images of himself seen through a prism. Their common focus, that elusive final definition of himself which he had sought for so long, still remained to be found. Timelessly the sand swept towards him, its shifting contours approximating more closely than any other landscape he had found to complete psychic zero. enveloping his past failures and uncertainties, masking them in its enigmatic canopy. Bridgman watched the red sand flicker and fluoresce in the deepening sunlight. He would never see Mars now and redress the implicit failure of talent, but a workable replica of the planet was contained within the beach area. Several million tons of the Martian topsoil had been ferried in as ballast some 50 years earlier, when it was feared that the continuous firing of planetary probes and space vehicles and the transportation of bulk stores and equipment to Mars would fractionally lower the gravitational mass of the Earth and bring it into tighter orbit around the Sun. Although the distance involved would be little more than a few millimeters and barely raise the temperature of the atmosphere, its cumulative effects over an extended period might have resulted in a loss into space of the tenuous layers of the outer atmosphere and of the radiological veil which alone made the biosphere habitable. Over a 20-year period, a fleet of large freighters had shuttled to and from Mars, dumping the ballast into the sea near the landing grounds of Cape Canaveral. Simultaneously, the Russians were filling in a small section of the Caspian Sea. The intention had been that the ballast should be swallowed by the Atlantic and Caspian waters, but all too soon it was found that the microbiological analysis of the sand had been inadequate. At the Martian polar caps, where the original water vapor in the atmosphere had condensed, a residue of ancient organic matter formed the topsoil, a fine sandy loess containing the fossilized spores of the giant lichens and mosses which had been the last living organisms on the planet millions of years earlier. Embedded in these spores were the crystal lattices of the viruses which had once preyed on the plants, and traces of these were carried back to Earth with the Canaveral and Caspian ballast. A few years afterwards, a drastic increase in a wide range of plant diseases was noticed in the southern states of America, in the Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan republics of the Soviet Union. All over Florida there were outbreaks of blight and mosaic disease. Orange plantations withered and died. Stunted palms split by the roadside like dried banana skins. Sawgrass stiffened into paper spears in the summer heat. Within a few years, the entire peninsula was transformed into a desert. The swampy jungles of the Everglades became bleached and dry, the rivers cracked husks strewn with the gleaming skeletons of crocodiles and birds, the forests petrified. The former launching ground at Canaveral was closed, and shortly afterwards the Cocoa Beach resorts were sealed off and evacuated. Billions of dollars of real estate were abandoned to the virus. Fortunately never virulent to animal hosts, its influence was confined to within a small radius of the original loess which had borne it, unless ingested by the human organism when it symbioted with the bacteria in the gut flora, benign and unknown to the host, but devastating to vegetation thousands of miles from Canaveral if returned to the soil. Unable to rest despite his sleepless night, Bridgman played irritably with the tape recorder. During their close escape from the wardens, he had more than half hoped they would catch him. The mysterious leg cramp was obviously psychogenic. Although unable to accept consciously the logic of Webster's argument, he would willingly have conceded to the fait accompli of physical capture, gratefully submitted to a year's quarantine at the parasitological cleansing unit at Tampa, and then returned to his career as an architect, chastened but accepting his failure. As yet, however, the opportunity for surrender had failed to offer itself. Travis appeared to be aware of his ambivalent motives. Bridgman noticed that he and Louise Woodward had made no arrangements to meet him that evening for the conjunction. In the early afternoon, he went down into the streets, ploughed through the drifts of red sand, following the footprints of Travis and Louise as they wound in and out of the side streets, finally saw them disappear into the coarser, flint-like dunes among the submerged motels to the south of the town. Giving up, he returned through the empty, shadowless streets, now and then shouted up into the hot air, listening to the echoes boom away among the dunes. Later that afternoon, he walked out towards the northeast, picking his way carefully through the dips and hollows, crouching in the pools of shadow, whenever the distant sounds of the construction gangs along the perimeter were carried across to him by the wind. Around him, in the great dust basins, the grains of red sand glittered like diamonds. Barbs of rusting metal protruded from the slopes, remnants of Mars satellites and launching stages, which had fallen onto the Martian deserts and then been carried back again to Earth. One fragment which he passed, a complete section of hull plate like a concave shield, still carried part of an identification numeral, and stood upright in the dissolving sand like a door into nowhere. Just before dusk, he reached a tall spur of obsidian that reared up into the tinted, serried sky like the spire of a ruined church, climbed up among its jutting cornices, and looked out across the intervening 2 or 3 miles of dunes to the perimeter. Illuminated by the last light, the metal grilles shone with a roseate glow like fairy portcullises on the edge of an enchanted sea. At least half a mile of the fence had been completed, and as he watched, another of the giant prefabricated sections was cantilevered into the air and staked to the ground. Already the eastern horizon was cut off by the encroaching fence, the enclosed Martian sand like the gravel scattered at the bottom of a cage. Perched on the spur, Bridgman felt a warning tremor of pain in his calf. He leapt down in a flurry of dust. Without looking back, made off among the dunes and reefs. Later, as the last baroque walls of the sunset faded below the horizon, he waited on the roof for Travis and Louise Woodward, peering impatiently into the empty moon-filled streets. Shortly after midnight, at an elevation of 35 degrees in the southwest, between Aquila and Ophiuchus, the conjunction began. Bridgman continued to search the streets and ignored the 7 points of speeding light as they raced towards him from the horizon like an invasion from deep space. There was no indication of their convergent orbital pathways, which would soon scatter them thousands of miles apart, and the satellites moved as if they were always together in the tight configurations Bridgman had known since childhood, like a lost zodiacal emblem, a constellation detached from the celestial sphere, and forever frantically searching to return to its place. "Travis, confound you!" With a snarl, Bridgman swung away from the balcony and moved along to the exposed section. TFDN. Of rail behind the elevator head. To be avoided like a pariah by Travis and Louise Woodward forced him to accept that he was no longer a true resident of the beach and now existed in a no-man's land between them and the wardens. 7 satellites drew nearer, and Bridgman glanced up at them curiously. They were disposed in a distinctive but unusual pattern resembling the Greek letter X, a limp cross, a straight laternal member containing 4 capsules more or less in line ahead: Connolly, Chakev, Merrill, Mayakovsky, bisected by 3 others forming of Chakev an elongated Z, Pokrovsky, Woodward, and Brodiznek. The pattern had been variously identified as a hammer and sickle, an eagle, a swastika, and a dove, as well as a variety of religious and runic emblems, but all these are being defeated by the advancing tendency of the older capsules to vaporize. It was the slow disintegration of the aluminium shells, that made them visible. It had often been pointed out, but the observer on the ground was looking not at the actual capsule, but at a local field of vaporized aluminium and ionized hydrogen, peroxide gas from the ruptured attitude jets now distributed within half a mile of each of the capsules. Woodward's, the most recently in orbit, was a barely perceptible point of light. The hulks of the capsules, with their perfectly preserved human cargoes, were continually dissolving, and a white fan of silver spray opened out in a phantom wake behind Merrill and Pokrovsky, 1998 and 1999, like a double star transforming itself into a nova in the center of a constellation. As the mass of the capsules diminished, they sank into a closer orbit around the Earth, would soon touch the denser layers of the atmosphere and plummet to the ground. Bridgman watched the satellites as they moved towards him, his irritation with Travis forgotten. As always, he felt himself moved by the eerie but strangely serene spectacle of the ghostly convoy endlessly circling the dark sea of the midnight sky, the long-dead astronauts converging for the 10,000th time upon their brief rendezvous and then setting off upon their lonely flight paths around the perimeter of the ionosphere, the tidal edge of the beach way into space which had reclaimed them. How Louise Woodward could bear to look up at her husband he had never been able to understand. After her arrival, he once invited her to the hotel, remarking that there was an excellent view of the beautiful sunsets, and she had snapped back bitterly, "Beautiful? Can you imagine what it's like looking up at a sunset when your husband's spinning through it in his coffin?" This reaction had been a common one when the first astronauts had died after failing to make contact with the launching platforms in fixed orbit. When these new stars rose in the west and an attempt had been made to shoot them down, there was the unsettling prospect of the skies 1,000 years hence, littered with orbiting refuse, but later they were left in this natural graveyard, forming their own monument. Obscured by the clouds of dust carried up into the air by the sandstorm, the satellites shone with little more than the intensity of second-magnitude stars, winking as the reflected light was interrupted by the lanes of Stratosirus. The wake of diffusing light behind Merrill and Pokrovsky, which usually screened the other capsules, seemed to have diminished in size, and he could see both Mayakovsky and Brodiznek clearly for the first time in several months. Wondering if Merrill or Pokrovsky would be the first to fall from orbit, he looked towards the center of the cross as it passed overhead. With a sharp intake of breath, he tilted his head back. In surprise, he noticed that one of the familiar points of light was missing from the center of the group. What he had assumed to be an occlusion of the conjoined vapor trails by dust clouds was simply due to the fact that one of the capsules, Merrill's, he decided, the third of the line ahead, had fallen from its orbit. Head raised, he sidestepped slowly across the roof, avoiding the pieces of rusting neon sign, following the convoy as it passed overhead and moved towards the eastern horizon. No longer overlaid by the wake of Merrill's capsule, Woodward shone with far greater clarity, and almost appeared to have taken the former's place, for he was not due to fall from orbit for at least a century. In the distance somewhere an engine growled. A moment later, from a different quarter, a woman's voice cried out faintly. Bridgman moved to the rail. Over the intervening rooftop saw two figures silhouetted against the sky on the elevator head of an apartment block, then heard Louise Woodward call out again. She was pointing up at the sky with both hands, her long hair blown about her face. Travis was trying to restrain her. Bridgman realized that she had misconstrued Merrill's descent, assuming that the fallen astronaut was her husband. He climbed onto the edge of the balcony, watching the pathetic tableau on the distant roof. Again, somewhere among the dunes, an engine moaned. Before Bridgman could turn around, a brilliant blade of light cleft the sky in the southwest. Like a speeding comet, an immense train of vaporizing particles stretching behind it to the horizon. It soared towards them, the downward curve of its pathway clearly visible. Detached from the rest of the capsules, which were now disappearing among the stars along the eastern horizon, it was little more than a few miles off the ground. Bridgman watched it approach, apparently on a collision course with the hotel. The expanding corona of white light, like a gigantic signal flare, illuminated the rooftops, etching the letters of the neon signs over the submerged motels on the outskirts of the town. He ran for the doorway. As he raced down the stairs, saw the glow of the descending capsule fill the somber streets like 100 moons. When he reached his room, sheltered by the massive weight of the hotel, he watched the dunes in front of the hotel light up like a stage set. 300 yards away, the low camouflaged hull of the warden's beach car was revealed poised on a crest, its feeble spotlight drowned by the glare. With a deep metallic sigh, the burning catafalque of the dead astronaut soared overhead, a cascade of vaporizing metal pouring from its hull, filling the sky with incandescent light. Reflected below it, like an expressway illuminated by an aircraft's spotlights, a long line of light, several hundred yards in width, raced out into the desert towards the sea. As Bridgman shielded his eyes, it suddenly erupted in a tremendous explosion of detonating sand. A huge curtain of white dust lifted into the air and fell slowly to the ground. The sounds of the impact rolled against the hotel, mounting in a sustained crescendo that drummed against the windows. A series of smaller explosions flared up like opalescent fountains. All over the desert, fires flickered briefly where fragments of the capsule had been scattered. Then the noise subsided, and an immense glistening pall of phosphorescing gas hung in the air like a silver veil, particles of it beating and winking. 200 yards away across the sand was the running figure of Louise Woodward, Travis 20 paces behind her. Bridgman watched them dart in and out of the dunes, then abruptly felt the cold spotlight of the beach car hit his face and flood the room behind him. The vehicle was moving straight towards him, two of the wardens, nets and lassos in hand, riding the outboard. Quickly, Bridgman straddled the balcony, jumped down into the sand, and raced towards the crest of the first dune. He crouched and ran on through the darkness as the beam probed the air. Above, the glistening pall was slowly fading, the particles of vaporized metal sifting towards the dark Martian sand. In the distance, the last echoes of the impact were still reverberating among the hotels of the beach colonies farther down the coast. 5 minutes later, he caught up with Louise Woodward and Travis. The capsule's impact had flattened a number of the dunes, forming a shallow basin some quarter of a mile in diameter, and the surrounding slopes were scattered with the still-glowing particles, sparkling like fading eyes. The beach car growled somewhere 400 or 500 yards behind him, and Bridgman broke off into an exhausted walk. He stopped beside Travis, who was kneeling on the ground, breath pumping into his lungs. 50 yards away, Louise Woodward was running up and down, distraughtingly gazing at the fragments of smouldering metal. For a moment, the spotlight of the approaching beach car illuminated her, and she ran away among the dunes. Bridgman caught a glimpse of the inconsolable anguish in her face. Travis was still on his knees. He had picked up a piece of the oxidized metal and was pressing it together in his hands. Travis, for God's sake, tell her. This was Merrill's capsule. There's no doubt about it. Woodward's still up there. Travis looked up at him silently, his eyes searching Bridgman's face. A spasm of pain tore his mouth, and Bridgman realized that the barb of steel he clasped reverently in his hands was still glowing with heat. Travis! He tried to pull the man's hands apart, the pungent stench of burning flesh gusting into his face, but Travis wrenched away from him. Leave her alone, Bridgman. Go back with the wardens.
Bridgman retreated from the approaching beach car. Only 30 yards away, its spotlight filled the basin. Louise Woodward was still searching the dunes. Travis held his ground as the wardens jumped down from the car and advanced towards him with their nets, his bloodied hands raised at his sides, the steel barb flashing like a dagger. At the head of the wardens, the only one unmasked was a trim, neat-featured man with an intent, serious face. Bridgman guessed that this was Major Webster and that the wardens had known of the impending impact, hoped to capture them, and Louise in particular, before it occurred. Bridgman stumbled back towards the dunes at the edge of the basin. As he neared the crest, he trapped his foot in a semicircular plate of metal, sat down and freed his heel. Unmistakably, it was part of a control panel, the circular instrument housing still intact. Overhead, the pall of glistening vapor had moved off to the northeast, and the reflected light was directly over the rusting gantries of the former launching site at Cape Canaveral. For a few fleeting seconds, the gantry seemed to be enveloped in a sheen of silver, transfigured by the vaporized body of the dead astronaut, diffusing over them in a farewell gesture. His final return to the site from which he had set off to his death a century earlier. Then the gantries sank again into their craggy shadows, and the pole moved off like an immense wraith towards the sea, barely distinguishable from the star glow. Down below, Travis was sitting on the ground surrounded by the wardens. He scuttled about in his hands like a frantic crab, scooping handfuls of the virus-laden sand at them. Holding tight to their masks, the wardens maneuvered around him, their nets and lassos at the ready. Another group moved slowly towards Bridgman. Bridgman picked up a handful of the dark Martian sand beside the instrument panel, felt the soft glowing crystals warm his palm. In his mind he could still see the silver-sheathed gantries of the launching site across the bay, by a curious illusion almost identical with the Martian city he had designed years earlier. He watched the pole disappear over the sea, then looked around at the other remnants of Merrill's capsule scattered over the slopes. High in the western night, between Pegasus and Cygnus, shone the distant disk of the planet Mars, which for both himself and the dead astronaut had served for so long as a symbol of unattained ambition. The wind stirred softly through the sand, cooling this replica of the planet, which lay passively around him, and at last he understood why he had come to the beach and been unable to leave it. 20 yards away, Travis was being dragged off like a wild dog, his thrashing body pinioned in the centre of a web of lassos. Louise Woodward had run away among the dunes towards the sea, following the vanished gas cloud. In a sudden access of refound confidence, Bridgman drove his fist into the dark sand, buried his forearm like a foundation pillar. A flange of hot metal from Merrill's capsule burned his wrist, bonding him to the spirit of the dead astronaut, scattered around him on the Martian sand. In a sense, Merrill had reached Mars after all. "Damn it!" he cried exultantly to himself as the warden's lasso stung his neck and shoulders. "We made it!"